Buy my bike, sir. My mom won't. The trembling voice of the 7-year-old girl cut through the deafening roar of the Harley-Davidsons like a knife through silence. The sound of the engines died instantly. For men covered in tattoos and black leather stopped their machines in a cloud of dust, their eyes fixed on the small figure holding a handwritten cardboard sign, "Bike for sale, $20." The girl stood alone on the corner of a residential street, next to a pink bicycle with a basket that seemed to be her greatest treasure. Her large, frightened eyes darted between the imposing bikers and the dilapidated house behind her, where a curtain moved discreetly in the window. Jake Storm Morrison, leader of the Asphalt Knights, slowly took off his helmet. His 45 years on the road, fight scars, and extensive criminal record had not prepared him for this moment. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 years old, and there was something about the way she held that sign that made something inside him twist. "How much do you want for it, princess?" Jake asked, his hoarse voice softening as he crouched down to her height. $20, sir," she murmured, her eyes filling with tears. "Mommy hasn't eaten in 3 days, and she said I can sell my bike to buy food." The other 3 bikers, Thunder, Scar and Bull, exchanged tense glances. They had seen poverty on the roads before, but this was different. The dignity with which the girl offered her most precious possession, the shame hidden in her little eyes, the house that was clearly being evicted. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Jake asked, his tattooed hand gently touching the handlebars of the bike. "Keisha," she whispered. "My mom's name is Lisa and she lost her job when she got sick and now," her voice trailed off. Jake stood up slowly, his muscles tense. 45 years living on the margins of society had taught him to recognize injustice when he saw it. And this whole situation smacked of something much worse than simple bad luck. "Bull," he called to his closest companion, without taking his eyes off the girl. "Go to that store on the corner and buy everything a child and a sick mother need for a week." "But sir," Keisha protested, "I just want to sell my bike." "Princess," Jake bent down again, his voice laden with a tenderness that few would imagine existed in that dangerous man, "you won't have to sell anything today. But I need you to tell me one thing. Who fired your mother?" The sparkle that appeared in Keisha's eyes at that moment was not one of joy. It was one of pure crystalline anger that should not exist in the eyes of a 7-year-old child. "The man in the big office," she muttered. "He said Mom was expendable. That people like us are easy to replace." Jake felt Thunder approach from behind, his companions breathing altered by anger. Scar spat on the ground. Bull came running back from the store with bags full of groceries. But there was something in the way Keisha said "people like us" that made Jake realize that this story had much deeper and darker layers than a simple unfair dismissal. As the 4 most feared men in that county gathered around a little girl with a pink bicycle, none of them knew they were about to uncover a web of prejudice and cruelty that would make them question everything they thought they knew about justice. If you're enjoying this story of how 4 dangerous bikers discovered that sometimes the real monsters wear suits and ties, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what these men did to the big office man will completely redefine your idea of intelligent revenge. As Bull handed Keisha the bags of food, Jake felt Thunder approach. 40 years of partnership had taught him to read his friend's body language, and that posture meant trouble. "Boss," Thunder muttered under his breath, "you need to see this." He showed him the screen of his cell phone. "I searched for unfair dismissals in the region, and look what came up." Jake read the article silently, his jaw tightening with each line. Hartwell Industries CEO lays off 40% of employees citing necessary restructuring, local community protests discriminatory selection criteria. Hartwell Industries, Jake repeated, the name coming out like poison from his mouth. Richard Hartwell. The name was not unfamiliar. 3 years earlier, Jake had lost his own factory job when Hartwell bought the company and fired all employees with criminal records, even those who, like Jake, had been reintegrated into society for decades. The difference was that Jake had the Knights. Lisa had only a 7-year-old daughter. "There's more," Thunder continued, showing another link. "Look at the photos of the restructured." Jake swiped his finger across the screen. Photo after photo showed laid-off employees. 90% were Black, Latino, or from disadvantaged communities. Those who remained were, surprisingly, almost all white and upper-middle class. Interesting coincidence, isn't it? Scar spat, watching over his shoulder. Keisha approached timidly, holding a sandwich Bull had bought. "Mr. Jake," she said with her mouth full, can I tell you something about the bad man? Jake bent down to her level again. Sure, princess. Go ahead. When he fired my mom, she cried in front of him. Do you know what he said? Keisha's little eyes filled with anger that broke Jake's heart. He said people like us should be grateful for the opportunity we had, and that there would always be someone more suitable to do Mom's job. More suitable, Jake repeated slowly. Mom worked there for 8 years, Keisha continued. She never missed a day, never came in late. Even when she had a fever, she went to work. But the man said she didn't fit the company profile after he became boss. Bull clenched his fists. What kind of profile would that be? Keisha looked at the 4 bikers with the premature wisdom that only children exposed to the cruelty of the world develop. The profile of people who aren't like us, Mr. Bull. Jake stood up slowly, every muscle in his body tense. In his 45 years of life, growing up in orphanages, surviving on the streets, building a brotherhood with men rejected by society, he had faced violence, prison, discrimination, and contempt. But he had never felt anger as pure as the one rising from the depths of his chest at that moment. Thunder, he said, his voice laden with dangerous calm, I want you to find out everything about Richard Hartwell. Where he lives, where he eats, where he gets his hair cut, who he sleeps with. Everything. I'm already on it, Thunder replied, his fingers flying across the keyboard of his cell phone. Bull, Jake continued, you two are going to visit some of the other people who were fired. I want to hear every story, every word that Worm said to them. The 2 men nodded silently. They knew that tone in Jake's voice. It was the same tone from 3 years ago, when a corrupt politician tried to shut down the shelter for homeless youth that the Knights funded. The same tone from when they discovered that a businessman was exploiting children in his factory. The politician never got another public job. The businessman lost all his contracts and had to sell his house to pay compensation. Keisha tugged at Jake's shirt. Mr. Jake, what are you going to do with the bad man? Jake looked at the girl, then at the dilapidated house where Lisa was probably watching from the window, too weak to leave but strong enough to let her daughter sell her most precious possession to feed them. We're going to make him understand, Jake said finally, that people like you are not expendable. You are irreplaceable. At that moment, Thunder's cell phone vibrated with a notification. He looked at the screen and his face lit up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Boss, he said, showing a photo from LinkedIn, I just found out something interesting about our friend Hartwell. Jake looked at the screen. Richard Hartwell, 52, smiled in a charity campaign photo, surrounded by black children from an orphanage. The caption read, Proud to support our diverse community. Hartwell Industries believes that everyone deserves equal opportunities. #diversity and inclusion #social responsibility. 2 months, Thunder continued. After posting this, he fired Lisa and 40 other employees. Jake felt something break inside his chest. It wasn't just anger. It was a thirst for justice so intense that it made his hands shake. You know what the problem is with men like Richard Hartwell? Jake said, handing the phone back to Thunder. They think bikers like us are just muscle without brains. They think they can destroy entire families and then pose for photos pretending to be heroes. He looked at each of his brothers, then at Keisha, who was finishing her sandwich, watching everything intently. He has no idea who he just provoked. Each new humiliation only strengthened something inside him that men like Hartwell couldn't see, a silent force fueled by the very injustice they tried to impose. What that privileged businessman didn't know was that every act of contempt against people like Lisa and Keisha was writing his own sentence of defeat. For a moment, when Jake lowered his head to look at Keisha's pink bicycle, Hartwell probably thought he had broken another family. But those who know true strength know that it grows precisely in silence, and that sometimes the angels of justice ride Harley-Davidsons and wear black leather. 3 days had passed since the encounter with Keisha, and the makeshift office of the Asphalt Knights, an abandoned warehouse that Jake had turned into their headquarters, was buzzing with unusual activity. Maps, printouts of articles, photos, and documents covered a rustic wooden table, creating a mosaic of evidence against Richard Hartwell. Thunder rushed in, his laptop open to a screen full of data. Boss, you need to see this. I got access to Hartwell Industries' HR files through a contact. Jake approached, his eyes scanning the numbers on the screen. In the last 2 years, Thunder continued, Hartwell fired 127 employees. Do you know how many were white? 17. The other 110 were Black, Latino, or from other minorities. What about those who were promoted during the same period? Asked Scar, chewing on a toothpick. 43 promotions, Thunder replied. 40 were for white people. The other 3 were for administrative positions with no real power. Bull slammed his fist on the table. That bastard is literally wiping the company clean of any diversity. Jake remained silent, absorbing every detail. 45 years living on the margins of society had taught him that men like Hartwell were only vulnerable when attacked at their most sensitive points: money, reputation, and ego. There's more, Thunder said, clicking on another tab. Just look at the salaries he approved for himself over the last 3 years. Jake saw the numbers and felt his jaw tighten. While Hartwell was cutting jobs citing economic difficulties, he had increased his own salary by 340%, bought a $3 million mansion, and acquired a yacht. At that moment, the shed door opened and a middle-aged woman entered hesitantly. It was Sandra Washington, a former accountant at Hartwell Industries whom Thunder had located through his investigations. "You said you wanted to talk about Richard Hartwell," she said, her voice heavy with bitterness. "I worked for that man for 12 years. Until the day I found out what he was really doing with the numbers." Jake stood up, offering Sandra a chair. "Tell us everything." Sandra opened a briefcase she was carrying. Hartwell didn't just fire people out of prejudice. He manipulated the records to justify the dismissals. He invented absences that never happened, forged performance reports, even accusations of theft without proof. "Like Lisa's case," Jake murmured, connecting the dots. "Exactly. Lisa never stole anything. Hartwell planted products in her bag and had her searched in front of all her colleagues to publicly humiliate her before firing her." Sandra pulled out a folder of documents. "I have everything here. Internal emails, direct orders from him, even recordings of meetings where he planned the restructuring to improve the company's profile." Thunder leaned forward. "Why did you keep all this?" "Because I knew that one day someone would ask the right question," Sandra replied, her eyes meeting Jake's. "And I knew that when that day came, I would be ready." Jake picked up one of the emails Sandra had brought. In his own words, Hartwell wrote to the HR department, "We need to be more selective with our hiring process. High-end clientele expect to see employees who represent our brand appropriately. You know what I mean." "Son of a bitch," Scar spat. But Jake was reading another document, an internal report where Hartwell instructed supervisors to document any questionable behavior by specific employees, accompanied by a list with photos. Every name on the list was Black or Latino, including Lisa. "He planned it all," Jake said, his voice low but charged with controlled anger. "Every firing, every humiliation, every family destroyed. All premeditated." Sandra nodded. "And there's more. He's planning to expand to other cities, using the same model. Dallas, Atlanta, Detroit. He wants to purify the entire regional market." At that moment, Jake's cell phone vibrated with a notification. It was a local newspaper article, CEO Richard Hartwell named Entrepreneur of the Year for his contribution to the regional economy. Award ceremony takes place in 5 days at the Grand Hotel downtown. Jake showed the screen to his brothers. "Gentlemen," he said, a dangerous smile forming on his lips, "we just found out where and when we're going to introduce Mr. Hartwell to the whole city. What are you thinking?" Thunder asked, knowing that look. "Hartwell thinks he can destroy entire families and then go receive a trophy for it," Jake replied, carefully putting away all the documents Sandra had brought. "He has no idea that every email, every recording, every piece of evidence of his systematic cruelty is about to be displayed for all the businesspeople, politicians, and journalists in the region to see." Bull clapped his hands. "Public revenge." "Public justice," Jake corrected. "There's a difference." Sandra stood up, reaching out to Jake. "Are you really going to do this? Expose everything." Jake shook her hand firmly. "Sandra, in 5 days, Richard Hartwell's name will be associated with one thing: the truth about who he really is." As Sandra left the shed, Jake turned to his brothers. "Thunder, I want you to prepare a presentation with all this evidence. Video, audio, documents, everything. Scar, you're going to find out exactly how security works at that hotel. Bull, we're going to need some people infiltrated among the waiters and event staff. What about you, boss? Thunder asked. Jake looked at the photo of Richard Hartwell smiling on the cover of the local business magazine. I'm going to have a very enlightening conversation with our Businessman of the Year before he takes the stage to receive that award. That night, as Jake reviewed every document, every recording, every piece of evidence of Hartwell's systematic discrimination, he thought of Keisha holding the bike for sale sign. He thought of Lisa, too weak to leave the house after being publicly humiliated. He thought of the other 110 families destroyed by prejudice disguised as corporate restructuring. Jake had grown up knowing men who used violence to solve problems. But over the years, he had discovered something far more powerful than fists. Truth exposed at the right time and place could destroy a reputation more completely than any bar fight. The plan was taking shape, piece by piece, like a complex puzzle where each piece of evidence fit perfectly into the next. Thunder worked on the technical evidence, Sandra provided the legal documentation, and Jake orchestrated the perfect moment for Richard Hartwell's mask to fall before the city's entire business elite. As he organized the final details, Jake smiled for the first time in days. Hartwell had spent years thinking he was untouchable, protected by money, connections, and privilege. What he didn't know was that 4 men whom society considered marginal had just become the architects of his downfall. On the table in front of him, among compromising recordings and incriminating emails, was the invitation to the award ceremony that Thunder had obtained. Jake held it up to the light, noting the elegant paper and gold lettering announcing the honor for Businessman of the Year. For a moment, when he imagined Hartwell taking the stage to receive the trophy in 5 days, all the corrupt businessmen in the region would probably think they were witnessing yet another celebration of success based on exploitation and prejudice. But those who know the true power of justice know that it grows precisely in silence, and that sometimes the angels of vengeance wear leather jackets and carry evidence instead of guns. The night of the ceremony arrived with all the pomp and circumstance Richard Hartwell had expected. The Grand Hotel downtown sparkled like a jewel in the city center, its golden lights reflecting off the luxury cars arriving in single file. Important businessmen, politicians, and journalists mingled in the elegant lobby, all there to celebrate the Businessman of the Year. Hartwell adjusted his Italian silk tie in the VIP bathroom mirror, his confident smile reflecting the arrogance of someone who believes he is untouchable. 12 years building this empire, he murmured to himself, and finally the recognition I deserve. What he didn't know was that Jake was exactly 20 meters away, wearing a borrowed tuxedo and using a fake identity as a human resources consultant. Thunder had hacked into the guest system 3 days earlier, creating perfect credentials for all 4 bikers. Alpha position, Jake muttered into the nearly invisible microphone in his collar. Thunder, are you in control of the presentation? Affirmative, boss, came the reply in the tiny electronic in his ear. All audio-visual equipment for the event is under our control. Scar and Bull are positioned among the waiters. Sandra is in the front row with all the documentation. Jake watched Hartwell greet important personalities, his loud, forced laughter echoing through the hall. In a few minutes, that man would discover that he had completely underestimated the people he considers expendable. The master of ceremonies took the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, it is with great honor that we present the Entrepreneur of the Year, Richard Hartwell. Applause filled the hall as Hartwell walked toward the stage, waving like a politician on the campaign trail. Jake positioned himself strategically near the side staircase as Thunder began the sequence that would replace the official presentation with the evidence they had collected. Thank you, Hartwell began, his voice projected through the speakers. It is an honor to receive this recognition for my dedication to building a company that serves our community with excellence and ethical values. At that exact moment, the lights went out. Murmurs of confusion rippled through the hall until a new image appeared on the giant screen behind Hartwell, his own corporate photo accompanied by the words "The truth about Richard Hartwell." What's going on? Hartwell turned, confused, trying to understand why his corporate presentation had been replaced by that threatening screen. Thunder's digitally modified voice echoed through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, before we celebrate this man, you need to know the truth about how he really treats his community. The screen began displaying the internal email Sandra had provided. Email after email appeared in letters large enough for the entire room to read. We need to be more selective with our hiring process. High-end clientele expect to see employees who represent our brand appropriately. You know what I mean. A shocked murmur ran through the audience. Journalists began pulling out cell phones and cameras. Hartwell tried to approach the microphone, but Jake had cut off access to the controls. "Turn that off." Hartwell yelled at the technicians, but they too were paralyzed, watching the revelations unfold. The next slide showed the list of photos of the employees Hartwell had marked for dismissal, all black, Latino, or from other minorities. The voice continued, 127 layoffs in 2 years. Only 17 white employees were laid off. The other 110 were all from ethnic minorities. "That's a lie," Hartwell yelled, sweating profusely. "Someone hacked the system. These are fake documents." But the screen now displayed audio recordings of meetings where he instructed supervisors on how to document questionable behavior only from specific employees. His own voice echoed through the hall. "You understand what I want. Our company needs to maintain a standard. We can't let our image be compromised by employees who don't fit our corporate profile." Jake approached the side of the stage, finally revealing himself. "Mr. Hartwell," he said, his voice carrying through the natural acoustics of the hall, "do you remember Lisa Rodriguez? The woman you publicly humiliated before firing her, falsely accusing her of theft?" Hartwell stared at him, his eyes widening as he recognized one of the bikers he had seen in the company's security reports. Who are you?" "I'm someone you consider expendable," Jake replied, calmly climbing the steps to the stage. "Just like Lisa. Just like her daughter, Keisha, who had to try to sell a pink bicycle to get food." The big screen now showed photos of Keisha with the bike for sale sign and Lisa in her dilapidated home. The audience was completely silent, absorbing each revelation. "Do you want to know the kind of man you're honoring?" Jake continued, his voice firm and clear. "A man who systematically fired employees because of their ethnicity, forged evidence against them, and then came here to receive an award for serving the community." Sandra stood up in the front row, holding up a folder full of documents. "I have here 12 years of documented evidence of systematic discrimination at Mr. Hartwell's company. Emails, recordings, forged reports, all authenticated and ready to be handed over to the federal prosecutor's office." Hartwell staggered, leaning on the podium. His face had lost all color. "You can't do this to me. I'm a pillar of this community. I donate to charities." "Oh yes," Jake smiled coldly, "your famous donations." The screen then displayed a comparison, the amounts Hartwell had donated to NGOs, mainly for events with photographers, versus the money he had saved by firing Black and Latino employees to hire replacements at lower wages. The math was brutal. For every dollar donated publicly, he had profited $50 by exploiting racial discrimination. Thunder reappeared on the sound system. "The public prosecutor's office has already been notified. The State Department of Civil Rights has launched a formal investigation. And all families affected by your discriminatory practices are being contacted by civil rights attorneys." Hartwell tried to run, but Bull and Scar had strategically positioned themselves at the exits. Not to physically prevent his escape, but to ensure that every step of his humiliation was documented by the cameras of the journalists present. 12 years, Jake said, approaching Hartwell. "You spent 12 years thinking that people like Lisa, like Keisha, like me were invisible. Disposable. You thought you could destroy entire families and there would never be any consequences." The city mayor rose from the audience, visibly disturbed. "Mr. Hartwell, in light of these revelations, I feel compelled to revoke this award and initiate a review of all municipal contracts with your company." One after another, business leaders and politicians in attendance began to publicly distance themselves from Hartwell. His own business partners whispered among themselves, clearly calculating how to disassociate themselves from him as quickly as possible. Jake turned to the audience, his dignified posture contrasting with Hartwell's pathetic desperation. "Ladies and gentlemen, justice is not about revenge. It's about truth. It's about ensuring that men like this can no longer hide their cruelty behind fake smiles and calculated donations." As security guards finally escorted Hartwell out of the hall, not to protect him, but to prevent his presence from continuing to embarrass the event, Jake calmly stepped down from the stage. Sandra approached, offering him a business card. "Civil rights lawyers are already filing class action lawsuits," she said. "Every affected family will receive full compensation. And the evidence is too solid for any negotiation." For a moment, as Jake watched Richard Hartwell being escorted away by security, his arrogance replaced by genuine panic, his empire built on prejudice crumbling in real time, all the corrupt businessmen in the hall probably thought they were witnessing just another corporate scandal that would be forgotten in a few weeks. But those who know the true power of justice know that it doesn't just punish the guilty, it completely rewrites the rules of the game, turning the invisible into heroes and exposing that sometimes the real monsters wear Italian suits and receive awards for their contribution to the community. 6 months later, Jake stopped his Harley in front of a small yellow-painted house with a well-kept garden. Keisha ran from the gate, now wearing a new school uniform and a backpack. "Uncle Jake," she shouted, hugging the biker who had changed her life forever. Lisa came out onto the porch, smiling. She had lost a healthy amount of weight, her eyes were shining again, and in her hand she held the keys to her new bakery, financed with part of the settlement she had received from Hartwell. "The first batch of sweetbreads is ready," she said, as promised. Jake looked around. Thunder had bought a mechanic's shop on the same street. Bull was finishing painting his barber shop. Scar had opened a small motorcycle repair shop. The whole neighborhood had been transformed by the compensation and opportunities that arose after the scandal. "And our friend Hartwell?" Jake asked. "He went completely bankrupt," Lisa replied. "The company closed, he lost his mansion, his yacht, and he's being sued by dozens of families. I saw in the newspaper that he's working as a salesman in a department store." Jake smiled. "That's how justice works." Keisha tugged on his shirt. "Uncle Jake, will I ever have to sell my bike again?" "Never again, princess. And you know why? Because you've learned that even when the world seems unfair, there are always people willing to fight alongside you." As Jake watched that little girl happily riding her pink bike through the garden, the same one she almost sold for $20, he realized he had discovered the truth about revenge. It's not about destroying those who hurt you, it's about building something better than they could ever imagine. Richard Hartwell tried to prove that people like Lisa and Keisha were expendable. He ended up proving that men like him are truly unnecessary in a world that needs more compassion and less arrogance. If this story touched your heart and showed you that justice sometimes wears a leather jacket and rides a motorcycle, subscribe to the channel for more stories that prove that true heroes appear when we least expect them, and that karma sometimes needs a little help from 4 friends determined to make a difference.